everybody turning? I don't hear enough turning. Philippians. So my dad is an engineer. So my dad's an engineer. He's the polar opposite of me, which I'll talk about him more at some point. But he's pretty skinny. I am not so skinny. He is very calculated and thought through and slow. I am bombastic. But my dad, so as an engineer, he's an electrical engineer, he loves formulas, obviously. He loves formulas. So I'm going to give you a formula today. So anybody that's a formula person, here you go. Okay, here's the formula. Your level of commitment to something, to sacrifice for it, to live for it, or a person, is equal to your love for that thing. Right? If you love up to here, you will commit and sacrifice for it. And then your love, your level of love is equal to your knowledge, your experience, your appreciation for that thing. So if we're going to raise our commitment to something, we must raise our love, which is raised through our knowledge, our experience. If you as husbands are going to love your wives more, you need to get to know her and appreciate her. Because you will raise your love, and raise your commitment level. For example, my grandfather, as you can tell, I love my grandpa. I talk about it every week, I think I've talked about it. Ray Jardine, now I'm going to give you a name for it too. Ray Jardine. So, he was telling me a story about, he fought in World War II. He was a B-25 pilot, flew over 100 missions. He was an amazing man. He was telling me when World War II came, there was, and I'm sure it wasn't everybody, but there was a flood of men, of people that wanted to serve their country. And you guys know that more than I do, right? There was, not everybody, but there was a flood of people. He said there were guys lined up, trying to get signed up. Their level of wanting to commit and sacrifice for our country was very high. Because their love for our country was very high. Because they knew what they had in freedom in a country. Where do you think that level would be now? We get into a war? Right? Charlie's like, yeah. I think we'd have people running away the other direction. Coming up with all kinds of reasons. Rather than coming up with reasons that they want to sacrifice for our country, they would be coming up with reasons to not. And the reason is because their love level is so low, and because their experience, their knowledge, and appreciation is so incredibly low. It is. We just don't know how good we have it. My age, we think, my generation, we think we should be able to sit at a computer all day and make $100,000 a year. And be able to just search Facebook. Because I'm here, they should pay me. I went to college, they should pay me. And so that level of commitment and sacrifice for our country is so low because the love is so low, because the deep appreciation. If we are to change this, we must raise this. You cannot go out and say, everybody, we need to sacrifice and commit to our country. It's awesome. What's going to happen? They'll go the other way. And the same, that's what Paul is talking about in the book of Philippians. Our level of commitment and sacrifice for Christ, for the gospel, is equal to our love for Him, which is equal to our knowledge and experience and appreciation for Him. So if we are going to overflow and hold fast and explode the gospel through suffering, which we talked about in chapter 1, through joyful unity, which we talked about in the first part of 2, if we're going to do that, what is the formula? This is the formula. When you know Him, you will love Him. When you have a desert thirst for the Word, as my grandpa says, you will fall madly in love with Jesus. And when you fall madly in love with Jesus, you will smile in suffering. You will explode the gospel naturally. So as I get up, as I talk about the book of Philippians, throughout this whole thing, Paul is not making a horribly difficult list for us. We have to follow these rules and have these religious rites. What he's saying is, this is who you are. and he's reminding them and raising their knowledge and experience and appreciation level, which will in turn start to overflow into their love level, which will overflow into the commitment level, right? And as we talked about last week I felt like I was all over the place. And I know most of you feel like that. Charlie, don't say anything. I know you're about to amen that. Just kidding. But I felt like I had, in my mind, it was very clear. What came out, I didn't feel like it was so clear. But so afterwards, I was talking to Renee, I was like, man, I know the Lord uses it, and that's great, and I will let him. But I didn't feel like it worked. And Renee said, no, it was good, it was great, she's an amazing wife. She knows she needs to encourage me, or else I'll put that. But she said, one thing you might talk to them next week about is so if you look in chapter 2, verse 12 and 13, I said there were 2 if-then clauses. Do you remember that? 2 if-then clauses. I said I was going to pull them apart, and we look at them individually. Now, if I'm looking at you and you weren't here last week, don't say, I don't know. So, I got so excited about verse 13 that I didn't talk about the 2 if-then. So I want to catch that, and then we'll roll in through the rest of the chapter 2. Okay, so keep in mind the formula as we go through. But the first if-then clause in verse 12, therefore. Remember, when you're studying the Bible and you see a therefore, you ask, what is it? Therefore. Therefore is referring to what he just talked about. And what did he just talk about? He says, Jesus was the perfect example of humble sacrifice. So at the beginning of chapter 2, in verse 3, it says, do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. And then in verse 5, have this mind among yourselves, which is also in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God. So we have God, worthy of eternal, infinite praise, who looks down, and it says that he measures the universe between his finger and his thumb. I mean, this is Jesus, worthy of infinite, eternal praise. And instead of holding to his rights as God, rights worthy of worship, he lets go. He lets go of his rights as God, and he takes on the rights, which aren't any, of a bondservant, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be held on to, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant. So we see the highest of the high, the infinite God, becomes the lowest of the low. Not just a man. We would think if God became a man, he would be a king or a celebrity, and that's what the Israelites expected. But instead he became a servant. Born to a carpenter, born in a barn, worshipped by shepherds. Now some faraway kings came, yeah, but he was lowly, he was a servant. So not just a man, but he became a lowly man. And he served, he would touch lepers, he would feed the helpless. He associated with bad people, lowly people. So not only did God, the highest, become a man, he became a lowly man. And not only did he become a lowly servant, but he died. And I was talking to Ashton, my oldest son, as we're working through some issues he has with his younger brother, as we all did probably. And I'm talking about this, and I said, there are a lot of easier ways to die. I mean, a lethal injection is quick. He didn't take that way. He took the hardest, the worst at the time, the horrific way of dying. So this man that serves us, that let go of his rights, takes on our need for himself and becomes the perfect sacrifice. He dies. What does God do in verse 9? He says, therefore God has highly exalted him. Why? Therefore, because he humbled himself, God has highly exalted him. And so our first if-then clause in 12 is, therefore, if Christ, the God of the universe, can sacrifice for us, horrible, lowly people, then you and I can, in verse 3, stop having rivalry and conceit, and in humility count others better than ourselves, taking on the interests of others. It's the same. He says, therefore, if God can do it and go from the highest to the lowest, you and I can see needs, let go of our agenda, our calendar, our interests, and take on the interests of somebody else. And let go of our need, of our savings, or whatever it is. It's the time, it's our talents, it's our abilities, it's our money. And let that go and take on somebody else's. So the first if-then clause is, if Christ can do it, then you can do it. And the then we see at the end of verse 12, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Fear and trembling, that is the reference back to Christ as the lowly, humble servant. In awe of the Father, he sacrificed and humbled himself. Then you and I can do it as well. And remember, to work out your own salvation. It's not working for your salvation. It's working it out. You have it, it's like a sponge. It's inside. And you need to squeeze it and get it out. So just live who you are. Okay? So the first if then is if Christ can do it, then you can do it. The second if then is a little more hidden. In verse 12, therefore, my beloved brothers, as you have always obeyed, so now not only in my presence, but much more in my absence. So remember, the people of Philippi, the believers there, loved Paul. And they were excited. And when Paul was there, they were growing, they were excited, and they could conquer the world. But then Paul left. And now they hear that Paul's in jail. He's probably going to be a martyr. And they started thinking, wait a second. Maybe this gospel isn't all it's cracked up to be. Maybe it didn't actually work. And Paul says, okay, if you obeyed when I was with you, then obey when I'm not with you. If you obeyed when I was there, obey when I'm not there. You don't need me. And that's why he says in verse 12, it says, work out your own salvation. In other words, you don't need Paul to work out your salvation. You at Ark Spring don't need me. You don't need radio preachers. You don't need commentaries. Now, all those things are great. But if you lost them, you can still work out your salvation. You can still grow. So Paul says, if you did it when I was there, and now that I'm not there, keep doing it. Why? This is what I got so excited about last week. Verse 13. For it is God who works in you. Paul says, you don't need a great man, a celebrity, Paul. You don't need all these seminar teachers and these fabulous books. You need God. And what does Paul say? You have him! You have him! He didn't just come 50% or 75% and wait for us to make the last step. What does it say? It says, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. He comes all the way inside, changes those desires, changes that. How is he doing that? And we see that in chapter 1. Knowing causes loving, causes living. When we know him, we will love him. When we love him, we will serve him. And Paul says, you don't need me. You need God, and you have him. Back in verse 6 of chapter 1. And I am sure of this, that he who began it, not Paul, Jesus, will be faithful to complete it. Remember, the Christian life, if the gospel has stuck, it will produce fruit in you. The Christian life of sanctification is guaranteed because it is the work of Christ. You need God. I need God. And we have him. Remember, the book of Philippians is a book of joy and rest because God is so big and God is so good, like we said. We can rest in him. Okay, so then in 14 through the rest of the chapter, he uses 4 illustrations of his big main point. So what is the big main point we talked about? Everybody look back to chapter 1, verse 27. This is his summary of the whole book of Philippians. And I go to it every time because it summarizes perfectly. Verse 27 of chapter 1, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. It's be who you are. You have been given good news, now look like it. Okay, what does that look like? So that whether I come and see you or am absent, here we have it again, I may hear that you are what? Standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, so there's unity, striving side by side for the purpose. What is the purpose? The faith of the gospel. Everybody said the faith of the gospel 28. And not frightened in anything by your opponents. Remember in chapter 1, we talked about joyful suffering. No matter what opposition comes, no matter what happens, we can have joy and rest and peace. Why? Because the gospel's exploding. There is no worst case scenario for the believer. I mean, okay, they make us suffer so badly we die. Boom, we get the best of the best, right, in heaven. And then it is God's plan that we suffer. We see that as a gift. So Paul says, in short, hold fast to the gospel. Don't leave it. You have this opposition. Stay true. What does that look like? It looks like joy in suffering and humble sacrifice for each other. Okay? So now he uses 4 examples to prove this point, or to encourage us, to encourage them. The first example is a negative example. And now you're thinking, 4 examples? This guy's going to be here all day. He took half the time just reviewing last week. I'll be quick, maybe. 2 o'clock, you said? 2 o'clock, okay. We'll be fine. Okay, so the first illustration is, don't be like the Israelites. So the first one's a negative. Don't be like this, and then the last 3 are be like this. So the first illustration is, don't be like the Israelites. Look at 14. Do all things without grumbling or questioning, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life. And you think, oh, I didn't hear Israelites in there at all. Okay, now let's think back to the Israelites in the Old Testament, right? What were they known for? Grumbling and complaining, right? Stiff-necked, just whining, complaining. God pulls them out of Egypt miraculously. And what do? Not days later. Man, I wish we were back in Egypt. We had it so great. And what? Where were you? And Paul says, don't be like that. Let's just listen as I read in Deuteronomy 32, if you want to take a note, or if you think you can get there really fast. Deuteronomy 32, so this is Moses and God talking about the Israelites. In verse 5, they have dealt corruptly with him, so that's the Israelites have dealt corruptly with God. They're complaining, they're not trusting him. And it says, they are no longer his children. Why? Because they are blemished. They're crooked and a twisted generation. Wait, that sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? In Philippians 2, we hear it. Philippians 2, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. Paul is saying the Israelites couldn't do it. They couldn't be the people of God because they were full of sin. And remember the story, the grand story we talk about? And I was thinking about it today, and it's not history, it's his story. Okay? So his story, we started in innocence, and we sinned, and we have a soul death. And Adam and Eve didn't know what it meant to have death. And so God spends the rest of the Old Testament demonstrating what it means that we are dead in our trespasses and sins. Hopeless. How hopeless? No matter what God gives, no matter what miracle he uses, we are hopeless every time we sin. The Israelites perfectly illustrated. God pulls them out, they grumble and complain. He provides them with manna, they whine and complain about that. Moses smashes on the rock and they get water, and he's not allowed to go into the promised land. Over and over, God will give something. He'll give a picture of redemption. Does it take care of the sin problem? No. And he's making them, through the whole Old Testament, he's making them and us desperate. So desperate that when he comes, we will see him as a bright and shining light, which we see in Isaiah 49, talking about the coming Messiah. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. So he's showing how dark the darkness is, so that when the light comes, boom, it's an explosion. If I lit a match right now, it wouldn't really give off any light. If you're going to look at light, you would look at the beautiful glass, the colored glass. It's awesome. But if this was the middle of the night and there were no lights and I lit a match, Testament to demonstrate how dark it is, how crooked and twisted we are, so that when the light comes, we are drawn to it. So Paul says, okay, now, you are the children of God. God has come, Jesus has come and been the perfect sacrifice, and the light has shined in the darkness. And now we have hope. And Paul says, okay, you are the children of God. Now look like it. Look like it. The Israelites didn't look like it. They were crooked. Have you ever been to the lumber yard or Home Depot or Lowe's and you're looking for 2x4s? And I always go to the cheapest bid. Right? You go to the cheap, I'm like, okay, $1.20. I'm finding a great 2x4 in here. And they're cheap for a reason. And you start looking at, and my grandpa, they're back to my grandpa again, who was amazing, taught me woodworking too. He says, you look down, like you're sighting a rifle or something, and you look down and you can see, what does it do? Like that. I mean, it stands, and sometimes it does this. And you say, oh, you can walk up and see that thing. You're like, okay, I know I don't need that. You work through about 50, and then you find the one. Right? Oh, it stands out. It's straight, and you're looking at it going, no way! Secret treasure! Whoa! It's straight, and it's perfect. I can't believe it. I'm so glad I spent 4 hours here in this pile. Only 150 more to go. But it stands out, right? Straightness stands out. And that's what Paul is saying. Stand out. Be different. Okay, what does that look like? We expect this huge revelation, right? Okay, don't be horrible people and stay away from the top 10 most heinous sins or something. What is it that he says will make us stand out? In verse 14, not grumbling and complaining. Ooh, that kind of, wait, so I can't complain about slow drivers? Maybe if I'm by myself. You mean I can't complain about our government? Now we need to be discerning, yes. But if you go and you are looking for the good, biting your tongue. It says in Proverbs, even a fool is counted wise when he keeps his mouth shut. Okay? So what causes us to stand apart as the children of God without blemish, not crooked, but straight? And we stand out as shining as lights like Jesus did. What is it? Obviously staying away from horrible sins. But it's not grumbling. It's an attitude of gratitude. It's gentleness. It's when we think about other people and we start to think negative, we stop it. And we think, no, I will think about something good about that person. You're with your friends and, and they're talking about the neighbors next door or those people at church or that other church. You don't. We stand out. Okay? It is possible to do this. Why? Because it is God working in us. But man, we can stand out. We can be different. We can look like the children of God that we are. By not grumbling, complaining. And so in verse 14, I believe he's summing up what he said about suffering. So joyful suffering, not grumbling and complaining. And humble sacrifice to create joyful unity amongst us. Okay, so the first illustration is don't be like them. Be different. Be pure. Be loving. Joyful in suffering. And then the next illustration he uses himself. He says, instead of looking like the Israelites, look like me. And what does he say? If I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. There's a great reference here to the sacrificial system. There was a drink offering, and I hope that maybe you'll be intrigued to study that. Okay? We do have to get to graduation before 2 o'clock. Okay? But that's something you can study on your own. But in short, he's saying, I don't mind if I die for you. In fact, even though I'm poured out as a drink offering, if I am to die because of my ministry and service for believers, I am glad and rejoice. And then what does he say? Likewise, you should also be like me. Be like me. Look at verse 17 in chapter 3. Brothers, join in imitating me and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. How how are we to make it? I mean, he's got a pretty tall order here, right? Joyfully in suffering? I can't even complain about it. I have to love each other? You don't know my family. How do we do this? And Paul says, look at those that it's working. Follow examples. And Paul says, don't be like the children of Israel, be like me, Paul says. And then he uses two other people, Timothy and Epaphroditus. I think somebody named their son Epaphroditus. Can you imagine yelling that across the fields? Come home for dinner, Epaphroditus! That'd be different. That's a laughing thing. That wasn't anything serious. Okay? No. So he illustrates holding fast to the word of life, the gospel, through joyful suffering, through humble sacrifice for each other. He illustrates it with Timothy and Epaphroditus, and you'll just hear it as I read. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him, who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth. How as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me. And I trust in the Lord that I myself will come also. Then to Epaphroditus. I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister in my need. For he has been longing for you, and has been distressed because you heard that he was sick. Indeed, he was sick, near to death. But God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men. For he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. We hear that last phrase and we think Paul's being sarcastic and mean. You didn't, to complete what was lacking in your service to me. He's got to make up for your shortcomings. That's not the point. Obviously, Paul is gushing with love for these people. He's saying Epaphroditus did what you would do if you could. He overflowed in gratitude and service and taking on the interests of others and suffering joyfully, even to the point of death. Okay, so two illustrations. I wonder why he used, so earlier on he used Jesus as the illustration of humble sacrifice, and then he uses himself. And I think maybe if the Philippians are anything like me, I think, okay, God humbly sacrificed. He's so much stronger than I am. He's so much more powerful. Can he really relate? And of course he can, but we kind of feel a little bit of distance there. And then we see Paul. Paul was a celebrity. I mean, he was starting churches everywhere. All the believers knew Paul. I mean, he was big stuff. Okay, now I need to follow Paul. Yeah, but he's, how we do. Like, maybe Billy Graham or D.L. Moody, somebody that you knew of and really loved to follow. And they just kind of have this upper echelon feel about them. I think that's why he brings in Timothy and Epaphroditus. These are everyday dudes. These are guys that worked in the fields. They did the same thing. I think they just would relate better to them. And so maybe you and I, maybe we're discouraged. We think, I could never humbly sacrifice like that. I could never stop complaining in pain. I mean, pain hurts a lot. You know what? Remember the examples that you had. Last week in Sunday school, John, you were talking about a Sunday school teacher a long time ago, right? I think her name was Beulah. Is that right? And we talked about Beulah, and Beulah was just a great example. And it really connected what she was talking about in Sunday school to the point where John and so many of you remember. Who remembers Beulah? Yeah, hands all over the place. Beulah was awesome. Now, was she, big guns and preaching to thousands? No. But she had a huge impact. So in discouragement, when you forget, remember a person like Newland. We all have those people. And what Paul is saying is when you're discouraged and you don't know how to continue, look to good examples. They won't be perfect. But remember, there are people that can do it. And surround yourself by that. And then the second thing I would say is, are you a good example? There's a lot of older people in this church, and that's great. So many churches are made up of people my age, and that's it. And we're just kind of, in essence, floundering. Because you guys have so much experience, so much maturity. You have an opportunity to be an example that is so rare. Are you taking it? Are you an example of Christ? Are you letting go of your attitudes that aren't good? We all have them. And are you changing? We think, well, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Yeah, you can. Because it is God who works in us to change, to sacrifice for each other, to be joyful in suffering. Are you a good example? For those of us that are younger, are we following good examples? And are we a good example to our kids? We had the formula, right? Think about you. Just, you don't have to raise a hand. Nobody will know. Just in your mind, think, okay, where's my commitment level for Christ? How much am I willing to sacrifice? Okay? Wherever it is, it can be raised. Maybe it used to be up here, and you've known about Jesus, and you've gone to church for a long time, and you got comfortable. That needs to get back up. How does our passion and our excitement for commitment and sacrifice for Christ go up? When our love, when we fall madly in love with Jesus. And that can raise when we know Him. That's why studying the Bible is so absolutely necessary. Not for checking off a list, but to know Him. And they all come up. And you think, I've tried. I'm working. I'm tired of it. This is not your work. God has guaranteed. He is working this formula in your life. Dive in with Him. Jump in. Follow good examples. Be a good example. Because of Christ. Let's pray. Lord, we thank You for this day. We thank You that You love us so much. And Lord, I, like Paul, ask, Lord, that You would open the eyes of our understanding. Lord, so that we would know You, that we would have a desert thirst for Your word, and that we would fall madly in love with You. And that our commitment and our holding fast to the gospel would be unstoppable. Lord, I pray, Lord, that You would bring to our minds this week good examples that we have seen. Maybe we make a list. And Lord, I also pray that You would show us how we are good examples and how we need to improve. And Lord, I ask, Lord, that we would know You, so we would love You, so we would live